Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first of the Northumberland Learning Connections. Oops. What do you want? Do you want to put your? I have an excuse because we went out to dinner and we were four of us and wine was half price for the bottle. So two glasses was the same price as a whole bottle. And the other three didn't drink, so I had to take one for the team. Good evening, and welcome to the first of the Northumberland Learning Connections series on walls and the barriers that divide us. I'm Dorothy Gale, and I'm the current chair of the program committee. Before we begin, I respectfully acknowledge that the Northumberland County, where NLC is based, is located in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. This territory has been inhabited and cared for from the beginning by Indigenous people and is covered by the Williams Treaty. I'm pleased to introduce an old friend of NLC's, Karen Wells, who will moderate this evening and introduce our speaker. Just a little bit about Karen, because things have changed since you last saw her. She's an internationally recognized CBC journalist, we all knew that, lawyer and author. Her journalistic work took her to 50 different countries where she covered some sobering and thought-provoking subjects, including walls, the civil war in Lebanon, war amputees in Sierra Leone, the conflict in Palestine, and war rapes in Bosnia. She is a 3 times Canadian Association of Journalists Documentary Award and has received 2 United Nations Medal Award. In 2011, she was inducted to the University of Ottawa's Common Law Honor Society. In her retirement, she earned her master's degree in law and published her first book, The Abortion Caravan. And just last week, she came out with her second book, More Than a Footnote. Welcome, Karen, and we'll let her carry on.
Thank you, Dorothy. Yeah, thank you for that nice introduction, and you can all buy my book too, when Furbies get more in. Very good of you to let me introduce this tonight, and I think part of the reason is that we began thinking about this topic in the years BC, before COVID. So, it's been, and I was part of those discussions initially when I was heading the program committee. And one of the reasons we went for it was that we had done Newfoundland, we talked about China, we had talked about a lot of places. And periodically, we always come back to conceptual subjects, and that's why walls, because walls are certainly physical, but the thing is, why do we build them historically? Where do we build them? And why do we build them? Because we know they don't work, which is what is so bizarre. Yet we keep on trying. Put up a wall, and it's an invitation, if you like, to climb over that wall, to burrow under it, to get to the other side. And I'm thinking, too, of masquerading. There's a BBC correspondent, John Simpson, who was a very, very big man in every way. And he dressed up in full niqab to get across, not a wall, but a border, and at 6'3", he was discovered, as it were. But walls don't work particularly. They're also a way of underlining our differences, the image of, and of darkening the image of anybody who lives the other side of the wall. You think of, the most obvious example is prisons, and we talked about doing a program on prisons as part of this series. We talked about doing one on geographic barriers. I remember talking with Joanna Bonnebacker about dikes, which have worked, but are always a bit precarious. And the other thing, of course, that was going on when we began talking about it, and has been for a while, is a great proliferation of walls. So I think in that blurb, it said there were 7 walls in the years post-World War II. I've read there were less than 5. Numbers vary. Now, I've seen numbers as high as 90 all over the world. These geopolitical walls are being built. And the other thing, too, when we were talking about this, our friend Mr. Trump was, of course, talking and acting on the Mexico-U.S. border to keep illegal immigrants out. And that, of course, was a wall offense that had been started several presidents previously, but it became a political bargaining chip, or not a bargaining chip, something active, something useful that got him elected initially. So where are they? Why are they there? And what have we learned from history? And now, of course, there's books about walls. And back then, I remember I was walking around this incredible bookstore that probably many people know in Oxford called Blackwell's, 250,000 books in that store. It's amazing. And there was a book by a British writer named Tim Marshall called The Age of Walls, which is great. There have been a lot of other books written, a lot of other articles. A woman named Elizabeth Vallet, I think from Quebec, has written. And then I discovered a much more interesting book. It's more personal, it's more intriguing, it's more human, and that is called Walls Travels Along the Barricades, and it's by Canadian Marcello Di Cintio. And the icing on the cake came when we did our Alberta series, and we're having dinner with our first speaker, who was Aretha Van Herk, and we were saying, well, we're going to do this thing on walls, and I don't know quite who we're going to get for that yet. And she said, well, my friend Marcello, you have to get Marcello. So we did. Marcello Di Cintio lives in Calgary. He's been described as one of the most insightful and incisive writers of nonfiction in Canada. And it's a particular kind of nonfiction known as literary nonfiction, which does mean it's not weighed down with footnotes, yet still has credibility. It's personal and idiosyncratic. He graduated from the University of Calgary in both arts and sciences. He was a microbiologist. And he was also part of the University of Calgary's wrestling team. And that is not entirely a gratuitous remark, because that was one of the reasons he ended up in Iran for one of his books, looking at the evolution of traditional wrestling and at poets. So there's a lovely sort of juxtaposition of stuff here. I should mention, too, that his third book, Pay No Heed to the Rockets, Palestine in the Present Tense, is going to be the subject of our discussion tomorrow. And just before I finish up, I forgot the housekeeping details, sorry. After Marcello finishes presenting, coffee break, we're doing that again, which is great, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards. So work up the questions. Marcello has been writer-in-residence at the Palestine Writing Workshop, at the Calgary Public Library, at the University of Calgary. He's won the W.O. Mitchell Prize in Calgary, and I love saying that because W.O. Mitchell was such a neat person. And he's won the very important National Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing for his book On Walls. So please join me in welcoming Marcello Di Cintio.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. I need to make sure that I got my notes on this thing. Whew. Yes, so, and thank you, Karen, for that wonderful introduction. I think Karen is just as, if not more qualified to give a talk, the talk that I'm going to give as I am, and I admire her career very, very much. So I'm going to talk to you about the wall disease. What does it mean to live along the world's hardest edges? And as was mentioned, it comes from my research for my book, Walls Travels Along the Barricades, which came out a little while ago. So the wall disease, it's an actual disease. It was during the time of the Berlin Wall in Berlin, there was a psychiatrist named Dr. Hedgeman who noticed that his patients who lived in close physical proximity to the Berlin Wall suffered higher rates of depression, of mental illness, of alcoholism. There was more domestic violence in their house. And he blamed the wall for it. And he named it in German Mauerkrankheit, which is literally the wall disease. Which I think is a fascinating idea that this physical structure, the simplest of all physical structures really, can have this kind of effect on a person's psyche. And when I heard about this, and after some of my travels, particularly to Israel and Palestine, I got interested in the stories of the people who live in the shadows of those walls, the people like Dr. Hedgemann's patients who lived nearby. And I wondered if I could find contemporary strains of the wall disease. So I ended up going to 8 different places over the course of too many years. I went to the Western Sahara. I went to the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla, which are these little tiny properties that Spain owns in North Africa. I went to the West Bank. I went to Cyprus, to Belfast. I traveled along the Indian and Bangladesh border, the U.S.-Mexico border, and ended up in Montreal. And I'll talk about a few of those experiences tonight. The wall that kind of started it all for me was the wall around the West Bank, which it's been called everything from the separation wall to the fence of life to the apartheid wall. And Israel started building this wall in 2002, in the middle of the Second Intifada, in an effort to keep militants from crossing from the West Bank and attacking, doing terrorist attacks in Israel. And this is the wall. I think we've all seen pictures of this. This is the wall that I imagine too. These large, up to 9-meter, I think, slabs of concrete that surround many parts of the West Bank. If we go back to the original picture there, we can see how there's the green line, which is the international accepted armistice line, and the blue is the wall that kind of cuts in and kind of takes some of that property onto the Israeli side. Something like 10% of the wall is taken on the west side of that boundary. So this is the wall that I think most of us would recognize. But most of the wall is like this. It's this complicated fencing structure that will have an access road like this. It'll have a layer of sand that is constantly smoothed by the Israeli army, so that if someone does cross, they leave footprints that can be followed. And then there's layers of barbed wire, sensors, signs that like this that say in 3 languages, mortal danger, military zone. Any person who passes here endangers his life. Now, I spent a lot of my time, a lot of my wall's time in the West Bank in a little village called Jayus, a beautiful kind of little farming community in kind of the northern West Bank. Jayus is a very typical West Bank town, gray cinder block buildings, a couple mosques, surrounded by this kind of fields of olive trees and other kinds of fruit trees. Some of the olive trees are so ancient they call them Roman trees, as if they're around since the Roman times. Jayus used to be famous throughout the region as a place where you would go, Israelis and Palestinians would go to buy vegetables and fruit. They used to come all around for that. And then the wall came to Jayus, and thousands of trees were torn down, were chopped down and bulldozed out of the way to make room for the wall. And I'm going to tell you a story about a farmer I met named Saleh. And Saleh invited me to his home, served me sage tea, as the Palestinians of that part of the West Bank always do, and told me what his life was before the wall. He told me how he lives in a house like full of kids, and kind of a noisy home. But in the mornings, before the sun came up, he got to leave the noise of the family house and go to the field, the same fields that his grandfather had farmed. He had his fruit trees and some olives, some greenhouses with tomatoes and cucumbers, and that was the best part of his day, he told me. And there was this kind of this solace of being in the quiet fields, but also, it was doing good, doing what he'd always done, what his family had always done. Now, then the wall came. So now, what Salah's morning now looks like is he must get up a little bit earlier because he can't just walk to his fields anymore. He has to go through the gates that have been set up. There's a fence now separating him from his fields. So he has to go to a gate similar to this one, where some 19-year-old Israeli soldier, say, will check his papers, which he had to apply for, even though this is his family. His land's been with his family for generations. He needed papers for permission to farm this land. Salah was only able to get permission for himself and not for workers. So he had to he had to sell some of his land to other people because he couldn't do it all by himself. And he knows, too, that the permission could be taken away at any time arbitrarily. This happens all the time. But he has to show his papers to this young soldier. He has to lift up his shirt so the soldier can see if he's not wired to explode, and then he can go into the field. And he talked about how that solace and comfort that he had felt in the past was kind of robbed from him. He could still farm his shrunken fields, but that calm that he felt was no longer there, because each time he passed through, there was this military experience that he had to go through, these kind of daily little humiliations he had to endure. For him, that's the wall disease for Saleh, was this daily stress, this daily humiliation. I traveled to Belfast, too, a city that's absolutely carved up by walls. Depending on how you count them, there's 100 different barricades in Belfast dividing Protestant from Catholic neighborhoods. There's very few parts of Belfast, except for the downtown, that are populated by both, right? It's you're either in a Republican neighborhood or a Loyalist neighborhood. You're either with Catholics or Protestants. There's, in the same area, you'll have a Catholic library and a public library, and a Catholic swimming pool and a public swimming, or Catholic and a Protestant swimming pool. The whole city kind of feels barbed and spiked with barbed wire and fences. And of course, walls attract graffiti, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. There's even walls through a city park. This is through Alexandra Park, which divides, I guess, Protestant kids from Catholic kids when they go play. And we'll talk a little bit more about Alexandra Park in a bit. There's even walls underground. In the late 1800s, when the Belfast Cemetery was built, they put a 9-foot wall underground. There's a 9-foot wall of black stone in that little space in between the gravestones that was meant to separate dead Catholics from dead Protestants. So I can't think of a better metaphor for Belfast than an underground wall dividing the dead. So what happens in Belfast is that what you have is that people grow up in these individual neighborhoods. They never see people from the other side. Their fathers often fought the good fight during the Troubles, but now it's just teenagers who are there to protect their neighborhoods. And what does that mean? Protect from who? Protect from anyone on the other side of the wall. What the walls do in Belfast is they eliminate any need for personal vendetta. Your enemy is not someone who did something to you. Your enemy is someone who came from the other side of that fence. And whoever dares cross into your neighborhood faces fights, faces stones, faces bottles, or worse. And so wherever you go in Belfast, you're concerned about what neighborhood you're in, what side of the street are you walking on. So there the wall disease is this fear, this paranoia, this kind of idea of siege. And that kind of thing, it leads to battles where young men like this will clash with men like this, driving trucks like these, and leading to scenes like this when I was there in July during what they call riot season, where this was what happened on the streets of Belfast. The wall disease leads to such rage in the summertime that people start fearing the summer. Like, as a Canadian, imagine that, where the worst time of the year is the summer. When the weather is nice and the kids are out of school, it makes people nervous in Belfast, because that's the time of year when the riots and the violence and the vandalism begin. This is when I witnessed this riot when I was there, where young toughs were literally tearing parts of their neighborhood up paving stones out of the ground, eavesdrops from the sides of the houses of their own neighborhoods to hurl at police on the other side of the line. I also found the wall disease along the Indian-Bangladesh border, as I mentioned. So you have Bangladesh in the middle, and you see India kind of wraps itself around Bangladesh. There's only a tiny little bit of Bangladesh that's not bordering India. And this what you're looking at is the far northeast of the country, which is a beautiful part of India. But it's starting in the 80s, at least the idea started in the 80s. India wanted to start building fences along that Bangladesh border. And originally it was to stop smugglers. The idea was kind of refreshed after 9/11, like a lot of the wall ideas were, to stop, the given reason was to stop kind of Islamic terrorists from going through. And so what we have there when I was there was these very simple structure of a little pathway with these black fence posts with 3 strands of barbed wire. A very simple protective thing, which is a pair of wire cutters could get you through that. But even though this is the simplest wall I think that I saw, it had such an interesting psychological effect on the people who lived next to it. I saw another farmer. This guy, he was in a part of the borderlands where the people on one side of the line were exactly the same as the people on the other side of the line. In fact, before the wall went up, you couldn't even tell where the border was. The British had put some black stones along the line, but the rice paddies grew higher than the stones, so you couldn't even see it. And so, you would get your well water from another country. Your cousins would be on the other side of the line. I don't even know what happened. The wall came down. Finally, a wall comes down. Fathers on one side of the line would marry their daughters off to people on the other side of the line. You'd play cricket back and forth. They ate the same food. They worshipped the same. They read the same poems. All the same sort of thing. And yet, when that tiny 3-strand barbed wire structure came up, people started to see their neighbors differently. And I talked to one guy who says, yeah, we're best not to associate with those people anymore. I'm like, those people are you. Like, those people could be your cousins. I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, they're becoming more Bangladeshi these days. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? And he didn't have a good answer. He didn't have any answer at all. It was something about that barbed wire that suggested that the people on the other side were to be feared and not to be trusted. Even though a week, month, year earlier, it didn't mean anything. It hadn't meant anything for generations. So the wall disease there has this kind of this illogical, it causes this illogical fear, the fear of your own people. I traveled to the Arizona-Mexico, U.S.-Mexico border. I spent most of my time in Arizona. Not the best map, but this is kind of the region I'm talking about. Now, the wall was erected mainly, or the border security was erected mainly to stop drug smuggling and especially illegal migration across the line. As Karen said, we talk about Trump's walls, but there's been walls of some sort, barricades of some sort along that border since at least the 1990s. There's a story about Pat Nixon stepping through. They strung some barbed wire between America and Mexico, I think on the San Diego-Tijuana border, and she stepped through the barbed wire and said something to the media like, "Oh, hopefully one day this wire will be gone." And now we have this huge range of physical walls. And the wall disease there is deadly. In 2021, the Pima County Medical Examiner's Office, Pima County is the area around the Arizona border, they recorded the third highest amount they recovered 241 sets of human remains from the borderlands, which is the third highest amount in the last 22 years. And over the last 22 years, that office has recovered the remains of more than 3,600 UBCs, undocumented border crossers. This year, they've already found 148 bodies. Each dot represents a body they found. It's truly horrifying. And the numbers and that that image might be shocking, but many observers believe that the U.S.-Mexico border, or the border security, was in fact designed to kill people. Dead migrants form a part of a long-standing American border policy based on what they call prevention through deterrence. And this dates back to 1994, so Clinton era. The 1994 strategic plan called for erecting walls near the larger border towns where migrants could easily kind of assimilate and disappear once they had crossed. So what they did was they walled off the areas near the big cities, leaving open spaces in the desert, in the remote, uninhabited expanses of land, is what the plan said, where the migrants could find themselves in, quote, mortal danger. The danger is meant to deter migrants from trying to cross the border in the first place. Of course, that didn't work. The walls that rose near the border towns of places like Nogales and Douglas left the Sonoran Desert as the only open door to America, and the most desperate of migrants took their chances, and the most unlucky of them died of thirst, died of exposure amid the dust and the mesquite. American policy, in effect, transformed the crime of illegal entry into an offense that for many proved punishable by death. The border also passes through the Tohono O'odham Reservation, and here I found perhaps the most extreme strain of wall disease. The Tohono O'odham are indigenous people whose territory in that little white part was kind of their territory in the Americas, in what is now the Americas, but extended all the way down to the sea. And this is what the border looks like on the reservation. So it's meant to stop vehicles, but obviously humans could easily cross through that. And I met an elder named Ophelia Rivas, and here she is. And she told me how when the walls went up across the reserve, it cut off the ceremonial routes that the Tohono O'odham have been following for millennia. They cannot reach the sacred salt that they want to get from the sea anymore. There's only two gates that they must pass through, and at these gates, Border Patrol guys who are like cops who failed out of police academy are rummaging through their sacred medicine bundles. Or she told me a story about they would take the headdress made out of antlers and break it open to see if there was drugs inside. One group of dancers came to the border post, and the patrol said, "If you're dancers, then dance for us." And they had to dance for the men in uniform in order to get past. Plus, the whole, like indigenous people in Canada, the whole land is sacred, and the carving up of the land to build the wall was a tragedy. And the vehicles, the jeeps and the soldiers that are driving through it, and the helicopters overhead, it kind of destroys the sanctity of this place that is literally the body of the Tohono O'odham people. She took me to the border, and showed me this, where for some reason they built the fence to keep that cactus in Mexico. I don't know, they had to swerve around to keep that. I don't know how they decided that was a Mexican cactus. Ophelia found this was hilarious, and she kind of ducked under the wire and posed for this photo. And she invited me to pose under it too, but I was so paranoid, perhaps the wall disease affected me too, that I would cross underneath and get busted by Border Patrol and be deported or something. And she thought this was funny, but her smile didn't last very long, because she told me a story about elders that she knew who had passed away since the wall started being built. And she said that every few months another elder would die, and she would cut a little bit of her hair off. This is part of the tradition. She cut some of her hair off every time an elder would die, and then another one would, and another one would. And she believed that it was seeing their sacred land defiled this way, having the roots of their ceremonies taken away from them, was too much for these old men and women to handle. And they died. And she said by the end of the year, all her hair was gone. She had to cut her hair for so many elders who had passed away. And so in this sense, the wall disease ended up being a fatal disease for the elders of the Tohono O'odham, which is certainly the strongest kind of strain of the wall disease that I would find. And that leads down to a brief aside. I want to talk about a little bit about how the walls don't just cause psychological disorders, but how they hurt our physical bodies. In an attempt to control our borders, we've designed systems to physically hurt those people who try to defy it. The walls act upon the flesh. It's a story from 2011. Here's the fencing along the Indian-Bangladesh border. And there was a young girl named Falani Khatun. She was 15 years old, and she was engaged to be married to a man on the Bangladesh side of the wall. And on the morning of her wedding, her father paid a pair of cattle smugglers to kind of smuggle Falani over the fence, so they can go to the village to get married. Now, she climbed the fence with a bamboo ladder that the smugglers provided, but when the barbed wire snagged onto her skirt, she panicked and started to scream, and the noise alerted the Indian border soldiers, who just fired their rifles in the direction of the screaming. And a single bullet pierced Falani's chest, and she sagged, like dead, mortally wounded on the wire. And this is a terrible photo, but this is Falani. And she begged for water for half an hour before finally dying. And she hung upside down there until the morning when the sun burned away the fog. And then they carried her away on a bamboo pole, like she was like some sort of animal. I have a picture of that too, and I won't show it to you. But just this is how the wall is a physical thing as well. On the U.S.-Mexico border, in addition to those who die trying to cross that I mentioned, doctors at the University of Arizona Medical Center treat about 40 migrants every year for broken bones and spinal injuries suffered from falls off the border wall. But it's not just accidents. There have been over 230 fatal encounters with Border Patrol agents since 2010, resulting from things like use of force, vehicle collisions, lack of medical attention, and perhaps most troublingly, off-duty homicides. Some migrants were killed on the south side of the border by American agents shooting through the wall into Mexico. And female migrants risk an even more intimate type of violence. Activists talk about the rape trees in the borderlands, where smugglers will take some of their female charges and sexually assault them at the base of these trees, and then hang their bras from the branches as some sort of like accounting, some sort of their conquests. A truly horrible, morbid thing. In his book about barbed wire, Reviel Netz wrote, "Our skins, just a little beneath the surface, are endowed with special nerves activated by pressure rising above rather low thresholds. You can use those nerves against us. By cutting through the boundary of our skins, you can protect the boundaries of your property, your prison, your border." I find that a really compelling line. And this is what our walls do. They exploit our body's low threshold for pain. So beneath the high-minded ideals of security and sovereignty lies the grim truth that we've designed the walls to hurt people. We opt to control movement across sensitive geography by inflicting agony upon the flesh. And I think that's important to remember. I'm going to go back to the psychological stuff, though, first. So, what's the cure for the wall disease? Dr. Hedgeman said the fall of the wall was going to be the cure. Now, he wasn't there. He managed to defect to the United States by the time the wall came down. But there was another East German psychiatrist there, Dr. Maas, who said the wall's fall was the emotional climax of the unloading, the cathartic breaking through of the unconscious. And he added that the emotional blockage unclogged, the repressed came to the surface, and the parts that had been split united. In other words, the wall disease had been cured. Now, I haven't seen any walls actually come down on my visits, and since my time, there's more walls now than there was when I first worked on this book. But I have seen them taken down artistically, and I want to talk a little bit about that. For example, in Belfast, there's an organization called Draw Down the Walls, and one of their goals is to disappear Belfast barriers. And so they do things like this, where they post a high-resolution photograph on both sides of the barrier that show the view from the other side. So essentially, you're looking through the wall here. You can tell if you can get your camera right, it lines up perfectly. And the idea was to imagine what Belfast would be like without its barriers. Draw Down the Wall also was working in Alexandra Park, which I mentioned earlier. So what they did first, they did one of these photographs on the wall to kind of show you the path along the other side. And then there was a ceremony where the the local government had decided to open the wall and let people cross through. And the politicians were patting themselves on the back and saying, oh, this is an important day for Northern Ireland. Really? Let me tell you about this about this opening. It's not anywhere near a troubled area. It's not in a residential area. It never offered any kind of protection for anyone else. Therefore, it was kind of a relatively easy wall, to fall. And still, the wall was only, for 3 months, the wall was open on weekdays only, between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., closed at night and at weekends. So the only time that children could do this frolicking through the wall was while they were supposed to be in school. So it was for show. It really didn't mean anything. Another interesting wall art project I saw was something called the Send a Message project in Ramallah. And how this works was that anyone could go into their website, pay a small fee, I forget what it was, and then put a message onto their website. And then this guy, would spray paint your message on the wall, take a photograph of it, and then send it to someone he wanted it to go to. And so when I was in Ramallah, there was like hundreds of these messages everywhere. And at first I didn't think very much of it. I thought it was kind of gimmicky. And I expected like messages like the one in the middle. Shame on the U.S. government for paying for this atrocity. Californians love Palestine. But there was much more of the other kind of message. I don't know if you can see it. There's on the right, it's an advertisement for a FM radio station. And on the left is just the word bushy, and I don't know what that means. There was lots of love messages on it. Stephen loves Madeline, Nicholas, Natalie, Lucy, and Sophia. They live in Canada. Have a nice little Canadian content. And there were several wedding proposals on the wall too. And this was my favorite one. In my previous life, I was the Berlin Wall. The beer was better there. And I find it so interesting how obviously this project is not taking down any walls, but it's kind of robbing the wall of its menace and its seriousness, right? If you take this wall and treat it like it's a bathroom wall you'd scrawl for a good time call on, you're kind of diminishing its power. And I found that it was especially when you're putting nonsense on it, like bushy and FM radio advertisements, or when someone put a falafel recipe on there. You're kind of robbing of its strength. But my favorite of the wall artists was on the U.S.-Mexico border between Arizona and Sonora, which at the time looked like this. This is the wall was built with helicopter landing mats that were recycled from the first Gulf War, and they just would hammer them up on the border. Very ugly. But there's a guy named Glenn Wayant who played the wall. He was this avant-garde percussionist, and what he would do is he'd go to the wall, he'd stick a contact microphone onto the metal, and take drumsticks and egg beaters and bamboo, and just play the wall. He'd make these really weird recordings of the sounds. He would take a cello bow and bow like the barbed wire or the clips on it, and he'd make these crazy recordings that sounded just terrible, like kind of this metallic whining and moaning and rattling. But his idea was, well, if they're going to put this incredibly expensive thing on the border, I'm going to turn it into a musical instrument, and that's his way of kind of challenging it. And what was most interesting, and so I got to play a duet with Glenn on the wall, which I was very excited about. But what was really interesting is that when he stopped playing it, so he stepped back with his drumsticks, and the contact microphone was still on it. It still made sound, right? Because the heat of the day the metal would expand and shrink, and so the microphone would hear things that we couldn't hear. But it would resonate with what happened on either side of the wall, right? The wall did not know sonically what was south and north. It didn't know what side was Mexico or America. It moaned and yawned and creaked the same from both sides. So in a way, sonically, it unified both sides, which I thought was a very kind of a very poetic way of looking at things. Glenn's a great guy. Eventually, the wall that I just showed you was replaced with this. These kind of bollard pipes, and which are filled with concrete. And what's interesting about these, the pipes are, you can't quite see it in the picture, but they're about 5 inches apart or something like that. So too small for someone to go through. But within days of that wall going up, drug enforcement officials in the United States when they were doing drug busts, they started to find these very uniquely packaged packages of drugs that just happened to be 4 inches wide. So immediately, the drug dealers, drug smugglers, had packaged their products just small enough that they can just pass it through it was like a mail slot. They're just passing it through. So yeah, not well thought through. But I was less interested, after my time with Glenn, less interested in how the wall was failing, and I was more interested in how the wall sounded. And so I sent Glenn an email and asked him, and he said, "My first take was dull and dead compared to the old wall, which, as you know, was sheets of metal rather than slurry-filled pipes. It's an industrially produced medieval monster. However, I'm getting to know it, and I've begun discovering how to play, amplify, and transform it. I've also been learning where to place the custom mics I built and where they pick up the sound the best. Yesterday, the wind there was real crazy, and the wall was literally humming from the vibrations. That was a nice surprise. So it's like any new instrument. There's a bit of a learning curve, and it will require lots of practice, and some seasoning over time. But I'd say it's already showing great promise as a multi-million-dollar instrument rather than a symbol of fear and loathing." And I'm going to end my presentation where I began, with the Berlin Wall. And I'm going to do something that writers are, I'm told by everyone not to do, and that's to read the very end of my book. So this is how tonight ends and how Walls ends. In 1992, on the occasion of Montreal's 350th birthday, the city of Berlin gave the city a rough sliver of concrete about 3 meters tall and 1 meter wide, salvaged from the wall's Great Fall in 1990. As you can see, vivid graffiti covers what was the western side of the slab. An orange sunburst, swirls of green and blue. The letters EAS, no doubt part of a longer word, truncated when the wall came down. There's no such decoration on the severe eastern side, just a few symbols and a few numbers and initials, the lost acronyms of the Iron Curtain. The slab used to form part of the wall near Berlin's Brandenburg Gate. Now it stands in a shopping mall on the first floor of Montreal's World Trade Center. I considered a downtown shopping mall an undignified resting place for a fragment of the Berlin Wall. The mall is a place to find an Orange Julius, not an exalted remnant of the Cold War. The shard of the Berlin Wall reminds us that walling is a human impulse. The ancient emperors of Rome and China taught us this first and passed along a hereditary urge to harden our edges with bricks and mortar, barbs and steel. I traveled to see what happens after the walls rise and to learn what it meant to live alongside walls. I discovered the walls breed societies of resistance in their shadows, resilient men and women who physically defeated their walls, artists like Glenn who drew down the walls by reimagining them, activists who worked to dress wounds the walls inflicted. Although I never found a wall about to fall, I did find a kind of optimism in the actions of the resistors, a faint glance to an imagined time when the walls stand disassembled in distant shopping malls. This is what I wanted to find. But I found more despair than hope. I found families shattered along the walls and bodies scarred. I learned of withered dead lying in deserts and saw hate boil hot and steady. Torn flesh and thrown stones did not stall the new Hadrians, nor did the tears of mothers and migrants and refugees dissuade them. The walls rise and grow and multiply. They are both human and inhumane. Our walls are our compulsion. The walls are our chronic disease. The cracked relic of the Berlin Wall stood in downtown Montreal because it revealed something else, that the urge to tear down barriers is a stronger impulse than the urge to build them. We cannot help but subvert the walls. What eventually wins out is not the crude desire to wall, but the impulse to break through. The piece of the Berlin Wall in Montreal was a gift to the city, a trophy, because it symbolized a fallen wall and a barrier that surrendered to a human compulsion greater than that which built it. The fragment reminds us of the inevitability of our better natures, and in this, the constant thrum of hope. The walls will continue to rise, and we will continue to tear them down. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Marcello. It's time for coffee, and then time to come back and have more questions. I have questions, so come, drink, and be merry. Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you, Marcello. Can I start by asking you a question?
Yes.
You can't really say no, can you? I said at the beginning, why do we continue to put up walls when we know they don't work? And I was thinking of, the bigger political purpose. Do you agree? I mean, that they don't work?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Then why do we keep putting them up?
I think in fact, the only thing the walls had in common was none of them worked. But the reasons why I keep putting up that there's different reasons for that. I remember asking a woman on the U.S.-Mexico border. She's kind of an activist, and she was telling me how, obviously, like, people on her progressive side of thinking hated the wall for all the reasons that I brought up, but she said people on the right hated it for it was a total waste of money and didn't work. It's total boondoggle, right? And I'm like, well, then what? Then why is it there? And she looked at me like I was the dumbest person that she'd ever seen. She goes, Marcello, close your eyes and think of it through the lens of corporate greed. And she talked about how many companies are involved in the building of it, the transporting of migrants to and from, the lawyers, the for-profit prison system. And so it was this gigantic money-generating scheme. And she says you can't think about it outside of ideas of dollars and cents. But that's the Arizona one, or the U.S.-Mexico border. Others, I was just speaking to a gentleman just now. I think there's a walls are very effective as theater, and they're very easy to erect. There's a problem. We have a problem with us and them. We don't get along with them. Instead of solving that problem, which are some intractable, decades long.
Takes a long
time. Takes a long time, and takes creativity, and takes compromise, and takes all sorts of things. Or, here's 9 feet of concrete. Here's a few spools of barbed wire, and I can tell my constituents, look, I've done something.
Let's pretend the problem doesn't exist.
Yeah, isn't that impressive? There was someone who told me. Again, on the U.S.-Mexico border, his name was Bill Odell. He lived right on the border, right on it. And he talked about how, these are his words, he says, I'm sure that some lard ass in Dubuque, Iowa, sitting on his overstuffed couch eating, fatty chips or whatever that is going to see this wall and think, well, that'll stop him. Meanwhile, Bill, out his front window, sees children climbing over the wall and pregnant women. So the idea but that image of that wall will make some people feel better about it. This was Trump's whole thing about it too. And there was an economist in India who said the same thing about the Indian-Bangladesh
which is
wall.
it is the biggest, longest in the world, isn't it?
I think it is.
Yeah, it's like around the whole country.
The whole country. If it's ever completed, it will be. And who knows that it'll ever happen. But he had said that Indira Gandhi's idea to fence off the border was a ridiculous idea. It'll never work. But it was nonetheless a splendid idea because it shows that you're doing something. Because it'd be even worse to do nothing than it would be to do something that everyone knows is useless. And he says it was all for theatrical sake. So there's that. Now, so the walls give a sense of security and not actual security, is what I guess I'm trying to say. But a sense of security is still something, right? That has value to it. To feel as if you're being protected by whatever boogeyman that you're afraid of. So that is valuable, but it's not what it says that it is. And it's a lot easier to build a wall than solve the Israel-Palestinian crisis. It's a lot easier to build a wall than to eliminate the economic pressures that push people across borders. 3 strands of barbed wire will do the trick.
Well, and can I just add an image that predates the wall in the U.S.? I remember being down in Southern California, and the issue then, of course, still is, migrants crossing the border. No wall at that point. Instead, and I went out with vigilantes at night, and you parked in the middle of the desert, and as soon as they sense something, they turn their high beams on and like deer in the headlights. But what they had on the highways, you know those signs for deer crossing and moose crossing? And what they had on the highways there was a silhouette of a family.
Yep.
A husband, mother, and 2 children
Holding hands. Yeah, I've seen
running
this.
across the border.
It's wild.
It was incredible. I mean, and that's, please don't run over the migrants coming in.
And those migrants that come across, and I don't want to take too much time, but those migrants that come across, and they've been sold a lie by their smugglers. Now, there used to be a time in the good old days of the migrant crossings where with a coyote, that's the name of that they give to the people who guide you across the border. The coyote was this noble guy who brings you across to a better life. And now the coyotes are mostly in the employ of the narco terrorists and drug dealers, and it's often the migrants who are crossing have to carry drugs with them as part of their payment. But they're sold a lie, and so there'll be all these times where I've heard these stories from the people who live in Arizona, where they'll see like a couple of clearly migrants, kind of Mexican or Latin American or indigenous people, like dirty and just kind of went through hell, exhausted, and they're like, we need a ride to Seattle or to Chicago, and they're like, what are you talking about? And because the coyotes would tell them, oh no, Chicago. The guys would be, well, I have a cousin in Chicago. He says, oh yeah, Chicago, it's just across the border. And so they'd end up in these places, and not knowing what to do or where to go. And that's not just there. I saw that in Cyprus too, where they would tell these migrants that no, you can take a train to London. So Cyprus is an island in the Mediterranean. There's no train to London. But they were just sold this nonsense by criminals who were human traffickers.
Trafficking. Yeah. Just indulge me for a minute. One little Cyprus image, because of course there were many, many Canadian UN troops. Excuse me. As you probably remember, I remember driving. I'm just going to keep talking until this goes away. Driving down the green zone, like right in between, with the Canadian troops, and they're saying, yeah, they're pissed off at us. They sit there and moon us every day, right? And you thought, okay, well, it's one way to register your opposition. Questions, please. Oh, come on. Yes, please. Oh, here comes Nedra. Nedra's tall, so you can see her coming. And she has a microphone.
Is it working? Is it working?
It's working.
Having spent so much time looking at the problem, being there, analyzing it, in the case of the Mexican-American border, what is the alternative to fences and border patrols and wires and walls? What's the alternative?
Stop screwing the American economy. This is what I was told by some activists too. Like NAFTA came in and destroyed the livelihoods of some of these Mexican corn farmers. For example, it kind of destroyed their ability to sell their products at a decent rate. That's one way. Another, is to have the way to legally to do things legally be accessible, understandable, available, because the employers who they need those workers. I'm working on a book right now about migrant workers in Canada. And employers need that labor. There should be a better way to get it, or an easier way to apply, or all those sorts of things. Those pathways should be simpler. But a lot of it comes to what kind of life is being led by the people on the other side of that line. How do you stop Syrians from coming across the border in Europe? Maybe stop supporting regimes that stopping that war. And these are big things to cover, of course. These are not good. I'm not giving you very good answers. I understand that, but there has to be a system that results in so much trauma and death and injury cannot be the solution. And I think maybe I'm focused more on problems and solutions, obviously. And I don't have a good answer for you.
Well, an intractable problem doesn't have a solution.
Yeah.
So no surprise. But if you get, in the case of North America, 400 million people on one side who are relatively prosperous and 100 million on the other side who are not,
Yeah.
how do you solve that?
Yeah. No, I don't know. But the walls don't even stop, right? I mean, the U.S.-Mexico border we're talking about. The stat I heard that 80% of people who want to cross manage the first time to cross, and everyone gets across eventually if they put their mind to it. They manage to get across. The walls there and everywhere else are so incredibly porous. They're not doing what they say they're going to do. Like I said, they act as theater. They act as a income generating operation for certain kinds of companies. So if that's not working, maybe we should stop doing that and focus our efforts and our money elsewhere. But like I said, it's much easier. I mean, Trump made hay out of that, right? Like he just, people loved that nonsense, and they might again.
Well,
Like,
and
remember what was the name of you called the caravans were coming? Was it the caravans that were on their way to invade?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
and then at expedient times, blind eyes are turned, right? I mean, there were terrible problems in Georgia because there weren't the migrant labor that they needed to bring in the crops. It was around the time of the election, and suddenly the problem disappeared and the labor was there.
Yeah, there were Israelis that were complaining about the wall because they had Palestinian day laborers would cross the Green Line every day to work, and they needed those guys to come and do the carpentry and all that kind of stuff. Now there's still every single day hundreds, if not more, of Palestinians do cross through that porous barrier. In fact, there was an excellent book written by Suad Amiri, this wonderful Palestinian nonfiction writer who actually tagged along with this group of kind of morning day laborers and went across with them. They got up at 4 a.m. with these guys and managed to cross. And a couple of them get stopped and arrested, but most of them end up at their workplaces as their bosses expect them to, right?
Well, and in Los Angeles, is it Sepulveda Drive, where all the illegals gather, and anybody who needs labor that day goes by, and that's where your labor pool is, right? I mean, everybody knows it. But anyway, questions, more? Yes, please. Nedra.
Sorry. Okay, you spend the evening talking about physical walls. In 1949, my parents hired guides, well paid, to smuggle us across the border into West Germany from the Communist Republic of Czechoslovakia. We walked through the night, through heavy snow, crossing heavily patrolled road. There was no concrete wall, but people still died.
Yeah.
We were lucky, we got through. So are the physical walls nothing more than just an extension of stupid borders between countries?
Yeah, yes. It's kind of this idea of kind of this fragile ideas of sovereignty or difference. Absolutely. I mean, damn, I wish you could. Can you write a chapter for my next book? Yeah, I guess we've seen this all before, right? And there are plenty of stories like yours. My new book that I have out is about the lives of taxi drivers in Canada, and one of them is this dude from Czechoslovakia who packed his wife and daughter into their Skoda and drove and ended up in a refugee camp somewhere and ended up in Edmonton of all places. But yeah, this has been going on forever, and it probably still will. But is that an extension of border patrols and lines and guards and all that? Yeah, I think that it is. Yeah, I think it absolutely is.
Well,
It's that certainly the impulse.
since we invented the nation state, right? Mid-19th century,
And
basically.
maybe there's something about that too. Like I talk about this at the beginning of Walls, where there's nothing we can. Borders mean less and less, right? Borders don't. So culture crosses borders. The same music we're listening here, they're listening to in Kazakhstan, Economies are global. COVID is global. Climate change is global. Nothing obeys the walls anymore. So maybe it's this inferiority, this idea we need to control something. That is part of the impulse to put the walls up, because there's nothing else follows the rules anymore. The rules being the lines that men, and it's always men, draw on maps. No one's paying attention. Nothing that's important to us pays attention to those lines anymore. So maybe if we put a bunch of concrete and barbed wire on that, people will pay attention to it. Maybe that's exercise some feeling of control over something, because everything else is even global terror, everything. Like, there's nothing obeys the borders. The fact that there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, it seems like a throwback to another time, because the wars we've seen has been ISIS and Al Qaeda and these kind of non-state actors. It feels old-fashioned what's going on now, because we're talking about borders and bridges, right? It's not. I think that part of the impulse comes from that loss of control, or that sense of the loss of control.
Everything permeates borders, but it's the people that we really want to keep in, right, or not let out.
Or out, yeah.
So, yeah. Peter, you had a question.
Well, not a question. I'm just following up on this gentleman's, what his question was. And I was thinking about your answer and his question. But I think back to the Berlin Wall coming down. And, of course, that was a political wall. But, in fact, after the wall came down, in West Germany, the German government poured literally billions of dollars into East Berlin and East Germany and raised their standard of living to a standard that I don't think they'd ever want to have that wall again, even if they were still extreme socialists.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if it really comes right back to, if humanity were to say everyone can be equal and we have to treat everyone and try to keep their standard at a living that they can prosper, I don't think there would be no need for a wall. And maybe the Berlin Wall is a good example of why it can be successful. When a wall comes down, you can eradicate it and it won't come back.
Maybe.
Does that make sense to you?
It does make sense. I think that the Berlin Wall is unique, though, in that it was a division and a reunification, which is not what we're talking about in most of these places. Maybe Cyprus is like that. Korea, maybe. It's funny. I desperately wanted to write about Korea for the book.
But you couldn't get into the north.
Exactly, and I thought that's where the interesting stories would have been. But now, look, in retrospect, I think I could have done some fun stuff not fun stuff. I could have done really interesting stuff from the south.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that there's a difference. There's a difference there. And another difference with the fall of the Berlin Wall was the fall of the wall signaled that the socialist project had failed, right? I mean, people can argue that, but that the wall coming down was like, this didn't work. Walls coming down. I think the opposite is happening in the walls that I'm talking about, where nothing's working, put a wall up. I think the walls are a sign of surrender in a lot of these places, which is different than Berlin. Berlin, it came down because we're like that. So I think it's different though. But I think places. I think Cyprus maybe, Korea maybe, where. But the problem, a lot of places, not the problem, but the fact is, walls often are on a line between the very poor and the difference in economics between one side and the other is incredible. There's a wonderful walls researcher in Hawaii who did the study about this too. Like the level, the GDP on one side versus the other is astronomically different. I mean, which is not a surprise. You want to look at Israel and the West Bank. You want to look at U.S. and Mexico. Even India and Bangladesh, in some places are like that too. But yeah.
I think there were questions. Yes, this gentleman here, Nedra. Black T-shirt. Please, keep calm, I'm the boss. Yes.
That's on.
Oh dear.
Yeah, I'm just curious why you did just mention Korea, but to me, the two biggest walls that you didn't mention keep people in, not to keep people out. One is in Hong Kong, and it was the longest wall for many, many years, all around Hong Kong, between mainland China, the People's Republic, and Hong Kong. And in 1997, of course, that all changed, and the wall still exists, but it's to keep mainland Chinese out from Hong Kong Chinese. And then Korea. The Korean wall is to prevent North Koreans from fleeing the country.
Yeah.
And there is a wall along the Chinese border keeping North Koreans in North Korea. So I'm puzzled that that would not be part of your manifesto. It seems to be a gap in your wall.
And in fact, I had a publisher turn down the book because the Koreans weren't in it. But yeah, you're right. And there's my original. I think it also comes down. It came down to in a lot of ways, and this is going to be a really lousy excuse, so you'll forgive me in advance. It was to do with time, funding. I spent 4.5 years working on this book, and exhausted all my grant funding by the end of it. This book has 8 different walls. My original draft, the proposal that actually got the publishing, I can't believe it. It was like 15 different places. In addition to the ones that you mentioned, which were in that original 15, there were walls in South America that I wanted to go to. There's walls throughout the Gulf states. There's a wall between Iran and Pakistan. I wanted to. The two that I really regret was the Koreas, as I mentioned, and I really wanted to write about South Africa, where kind of divided cities. Every home is walled up, during apartheid times, this was a black and white division, and now it's a rich and poor division, which is still really a black and white division. And I thought it would be fascinating to go and see kind of what do the post-apartheid walls look like in a place like Johannesburg. But you're right. I think there is a gap in the wall there too, and even since, like, I remember after the book is done, like new walls kept kind of popping into my consciousness, and for all kinds of different reasons, and there certainly could be a second book for sure.
You just need to get smuggled into Dennis Rodman's suitcase to get into North
I would
Korea.
fit. I would fit in his suitcase.
Yes,
Yeah,
Dorothy.
my comments about I have a comment about South Africa. We spent some time there, and my son did an exchange, and the house he stayed in had a perimeter wall that was locked at night. The house was locked at night, and then there was a gate in front of the bedrooms that was locked at night. And this was in, help me here, John, if you're not asleep, 1997, was not that long ago, and I would wonder how much of that has changed.
None.
But no, probably not. But my real question relates to the Korean walls that everybody has picked up on, and the possibility that has been in the news that such a demilitarized zone or something could be created between the Ukraine and Russia. And I'm not unique here. I was looking for your prognosis on such a wall, and is that a solution? Because that's what people are looking for to stop the war, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, that's what they did with Korea to try and stop the hostilities, and it's worked to keep peace, if you want to call it that.
It would be irresponsible for me to talk about the Russia-Ukraine situation and not knowing enough about it to really talk about it specifically. It's not something that I've been following as deeply as this kind of stuff, right? I mean, do we need it? My first impulse, though, is, do we need another demilitarized zone? Do we need another buffer zone between two places? I feel in the Korean case, in the Cyprus case, these are places that were united and now divided. Now, I guess Putin would say this, but that's a different scenario there. That seems so. I don't know what enough about that. Sorry, Dorothy. I wish I could speak more to that.
And doesn't it presuppose that Ukraine wants to give up territory?
Yeah.
And there's no indication that they do at the moment. Can I just throw one more thing in about South Africa? Because, of
Please.
course, pre-apartheid, they had homelands, right? Bophuthatswana and various other places. And the South African ambassador to Canada years ago, a man named Glenn Babb, sort of said, well, you know, we designed them from your reservations. No offenses, but same thing,
Yeah,
right?
I heard that.
Anyway, other questions? Yes, Mary.
I want to talk just for a second about the opposite side of what you've just said so that we can end on a hopeful note. There's a lovely book out by a man called A.J. Jacobs, which is called It's All Relative, and he decided to have the world's biggest family reunion. And he wanted to do this to prove that we're all family. Had the Sledge Sisters come and sing, of course. But in the end, the book goes on and on. In the end, he has about 3,000 people who show up in one place on one day at one time who are all related to each other, miles apart, all colors, all nations, and 30 countries hold family reunions at the same time. And that's a really nice breaking down of barriers.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that one. Is there more? Are there more thoughts that need
I
speaking
had a hard
out?
time
Yes,
at
here we
Thanksgiving
are.
with like 5 of my relatives.
I only
Does
have
my niece have to come?
I only have 2 relatives, yes.
I was thinking about Belfast and the borders there and wondering if educational employment opportunities align with those borders or services offered. Do you have to cross to get some kind of surgery, or are all the jobs on the one side for the Protestants and the Catholic jobs on the other side?
I'm not 100% sure about how the hospitals work, but I do know that there's 2 sets of services everywhere. Like I mentioned, libraries and pools, and schools and everything else. I'm sure there is no retirement facilities that are for both Catholics and Protestants. So so from birth to death, you were with your own community. I suspect, I don't know for sure, I suspect, yeah, you're right, that there's hospitals for one community or the other. Now, is one side, are there more opportunities for Republicans than loyalists? That I didn't get that sense. I got a sense that everything was doubled, which was just a colossal waste of funds when you think about it. The only places where both communities would be together was downtown, but the pubs were one or the other. Like Republicans didn't go to loyalist pubs, and you could tell which ones they were by kind of the flags, and you just kind of knew is how most of it went. The only 2 things that were bi-communal, and I know this is drifting away from your question a little bit. But the 2 things that both communities would be engaged with was they had an ice hockey team. The Belfast Knights used to play, and in Theron Fleury, a former Calgary Flame and now rabid anti-vax weirdo, he was like the star of the Belfast Knights for a little while. And so both Protestants and Catholics and Republicans and loyalists would go to watch hockey games. And the other thing was the Gay Pride Parade, which both attracted people from both sides, either in support or against it. So that was the only time that you'd have the communities mix was for hockey or pride. It was the only 2 things. But I am pretty sure that services are doubled up, and that's how that city works. Probably, and all the big cities in Northern Ireland, I suspect, are the same. Like I said, colossal waste of resources.
And there are other places where, I'm thinking of Glasgow, and I think Beatrice has gone home, but there's the Celtics and in the Rangers, and one's Catholic and one's Protestant football
You cannot
teams,
wear
right? No.
You cannot wear those jerseys into a
Yeah.
pub in Belfast.
Right.
They will not let you in because you are clearly a troublemaker if you're walking in
Yeah.
one of them.
Dorothy.
You can answer this to repeat my question. Aren't there plans to take the Belfast walls down in 2023.
Oh, I hadn't heard this. Is there?
No, well, I looked it up
Some
on
of them.
Google, but there is a plan to take them down, and I might be wrong on the date. Does anyone else
All of them?
know? I'm just, there are plans to take them down.
I mean, I've heard plans where like plans end up. The plans that I've always heard were for tiny little things like that Alexandra Park one that I mentioned, where you're going to open a gate for a few hours a day, or walls that are very easy to come down. Walls are in a place that they're not really needed anymore. But you know. It's not just the walls. Like people, if they build a new apartment building, and if it's going to be for Catholics, like there's either a space or a fence or some sort of thing between them and a Protestant neighborhood. Like it's part of your real estate. It's how the city is zoned. I'd be really fascinated to hear to learn that they're thinking of taking some down, but certainly the people I spoke to. They would all say the same thing. Yes, we should take them down. They're terrible. We should take these down. Just not right now. Just not right now.
We're not ready.
We're not ready. One day, but not right now. And I don't know what would happen. Like honestly, if the walls suddenly vanished by some magic, would there be chaos in the streets of Belfast? I doubt it. Interesting. Dorothy, you should be giving this talk.
If you believe it. Yeah. All right, one last question. Is that, yes, please, Nedra? Oh, good, she's got her speed boots on. Thank you.
Did you find when you were in Belfast that being a Canadian didn't matter what religion you were? You were neutral.
You know what?
We went to see a game of hurling I'd never seen before, and
Love hurling.
Everyone was really friendly.
Yeah.
But our friends stayed in their car.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You know, it is. I kept saying Catholic and Protestant, but it's more politics, not religion, that's happening there. It's not like all these guys I was talking to are going to church on the Sunday. You know what I mean? It's not about faith. It's about, do we want to be part of the UK or not? It's about politics. So a Canadian, I never felt I had to declare my faith at any point. No one ever asked me. No one ever asked me about if, you know, I guess with an Italian name they would have presumed Catholic, but that was never a thing. It was always more about, you know, what do you think of the Queen, not what do you think of Jesus. You know, like it was more that. But you're right. It's interesting you say that. Yes, they wouldn't go to a hurling match because hurling is a Republican sport, right. And Unionists don't go to hurling matches. They don't go to Gaelic football matches either, which is too bad because it's an amazing sport. They also don't go to pubs that are the wrong pubs. I had a friend from Calgary visit Belfast a few years ago, and I said, "Oh, Amanda, you have to go to this place and this place and this place." And she tells her friend in Belfast, like, "Oh, these are the places my friend Marcello had recommended." And she's like, "Are you crazy? You can't go to those places because that was not. She was I guess a unionist, and I gave him Republican pubs." But that doesn't surprise me that they wouldn't go out. So there's a wall that's in your. Someone talk about psychological walls. There's one. There's a wall in your head. Now, what would happen if they watched a hurling match? Probably nothing. You know, they're not. They're sitting down. They're not singing. You know, God Save the Queen or King as it were. It's so ingrained. That's interesting. There was a woman I met in Cyprus who was. So the wall I talked about in Cyprus came up in the 70s, and she was younger than the wall. She was in her 20s when I met her, and she's super smart. I think she ended up going to Oxford University, like just a super bright woman. I wanted to be a writer, and she talked about how she was happy that the wall. She was a Greek Cypriot, and she was happy that the wall was there. And I asked her why, and she could not answer that question. She didn't have a good answer for it. She said just something about it that and did she feel that if the wall came down, like the Turks would overrun the city? No. Did she think? You know, I don't think so. But there was something about it that gave her some sort of solace, and she could not, for as smart as she was, she could not explain that fear, and I suspect the people who don't want to watch the hurling would be in that same kind of thing where that's just not where I go. That's not for me. You go as a Canadian, but we're gonna wait in the car, which is remarkable and extremely sad. I'll say this about Belfast. I was surprised how much Belfast affected me. I was really upset by Belfast. All the places I'd been to, I'd been to Israel, Palestine, and was standing there in the middle of these demonstrations with tear gas and rubber bullets and all this kind of stuff. But I always understood what those who were fighting, what they were fighting for. I may not have agreed with their stance, but I always understood what they were fighting for. Belfast seemed to be so random and violence for violence sake. They used a term called recreational rioting there, where and like I said before, I watched teenage boys outraged that the other community was marching through their neighborhood. So in response, they tore pieces of their neighborhood apart, like I mentioned, and threw it at the other people. So that's they're protecting their neighborhood by tearing it apart. The car that you saw burning that I showed, that was taken from the neighborhood by the people protecting the neighborhood and burned in front of the police line. It didn't make any sense to me, and I was so it really bothered me a lot. And I remember asking a journalist, an Irish journalist, and watching these boys like rip their neighborhoods apart. And I said to him, and forgive the language, I said to him, if I went and asked that kid why he was doing that, what would happen? He said he would tell you to fuck off and punch you in the face. And that's what it was like in Belfast in kind of the hot days of summer. It really got to me in a way that I was very surprised. I thought the other places were going to break my heart more, but Belfast really did.
So one thought occurs to me, and then we will close. You saw this. We've got a thing coming up on the Pale of Settlement. The metaphorical walls, borders, places where other people cannot go. And the assumption and the automatic view is to Central Europe, right, where the Jews were isolated within the settlement. The concept started in Ireland, the concept of Pale. And it's the British who came in and said, you bloody Irish, you're within these borders. Mm-hmm. It is so ancient. Mm-hmm. It's more ancient than almost anything else in the world, so I wonder if that's part of it. Anyway, that's enough, I think, unless somebody has a burning question, and they seem not to. Thank you, and please join us tomorrow at the Port Hope Library for the discussion of the wall and the effect on one specific group of people, the Palestinians, and for sale at the back of the room, these two books of Marcello's. And I mean, I don't say this idly, they are beautifully written. It's just gorgeous writing. Both the book on walls and the book Pay No Heed to the Rockets on the Palestinian situation. So it's a good read. Buy them. Anyway, thank you and good night.